Hi everybody and welcome to today's MediaWorks Masterclass. Today we're going to be talking about something that's really fundamental across any organisation, any sector, which I think is around turning dashboards into decisions. So really focused on how to leverage data to build your 2026 strategy. I think we're going to talk AI, inevitably AI will come into the conversation today, but I think for me the key thing that we've all been talking about from a number of perspectives being around how do you actually leverage that data to drive all of these outputs, whether we're thinking about how to use data to drive website performance, channel optimization, using first-party data, etc. We're going to cover a range of topics across a number of areas, so it's going to be quite a broad conversation today, but really looking forward to deep diving into a number of areas. So my name's David Norris. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at MediaWorks, and I'm the host of the MediaWorks Masterclass. Today I've got Eve and Becca with me. So Eve, would you like to give yourself an introduction?
Yes, so hi, I'm Eve Monahan. I'm the Digital Analytics Lead here at MediaWorks. So looking at all things data analysis and feeding into the strategy and insights function. So really looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Becca.
Yeah, perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Becca Friend, returning on here for the second time now. Very excited about it today. So I'm a strategic planner at MediaWorks. So, all things strategy, work really closely with Eve and also the wider team to just sort of produce the best strategies for our clients. And again, really looking forward to it.
So I think for me, in digital, the promise of digital was always around the fact that it was much more scientific, much more measurable, as opposed to, for example, other marketing techniques, So I think for me, this is a massive evolution of where we've been and really is the aim of talking to people about in 2026, sort of how can we be leveraging that data? How can we be using that data to really drive performance ultimately? So I think we start with sort of things we think are worth you knowing. So would you like to come in on this one, please?
Yeah, of course. Okay, I'll go first. I think it's really interesting to kind of look at why campaigns fail. I think a lot of businesses don't know. And probably the biggest takeaway from me on this slide is over 30% of businesses don't understand who their audience is, which, who are you really marketing to if you don't understand the audience? And there's a little bit as well on touch points there. So me and Eve were talking this morning, there's actually 6 to 8 touch points now that every customer goes through before making a purchase. So if you don't understand your audience and you don't know kind of where they're going to, how are we going to get those touch points with them, I suppose? Yeah,
and I think when I'd looked at this, I think the more complex the purchase decision, the more touch points, because I think it was things like house purchases was 40 plus touch points, which I think is really, really interesting. So I think it's about then understanding how do we understand that journey? How do we think about that journey? And then how do we utilize data to really supercharge that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, that customer journey is getting longer. And as you say, with more kind of expensive purchases, people are taking more touch points. And I think marketers are being very open about the fact with that 32% stat that they might not understand it across each channel. And I think that's why it's really important to not jump straight from objective to activation, to really understand what data do we have available and how can we use that to kind of put the best foot forward. Because I think we'll go into competitiveness as well. And I think there's competition cropping up all over the place. So it's having that data can really set you apart from other people in the same space.
And what I would say is, it's got more complex, hasn't it? I think more channels, less clarity is so important because everybody who I speak to now, it's they always want a conversation when I speak to them about marketing, about how their user journeys change for different things and how platforms are changing their behaviour. So I think it's an important point to call out, isn't it?
Yeah, and this one was these stats were from the Salesforce State of Marketing report. And it actually shows that, yes, there's now 9 touch points on average, but this is getting more and more each time that they're doing the report. So I think, again, marketers are acknowledging those different touch points and they're trying to get in front of the consumers at each stage. So it's just really important to be able to kind of measure them to feed back into that strategy as well.
And I think the point that you made there about measurability is so important. Because ultimately you can do all sorts of stuff. I think in marketing, I was speaking to a prospect last week and we're talking about the fact that they were investing 75% of their budget in brochures, for example, that they do mail out. And they were even talking about how do they measure that and what the platform is that they measure through and how do they measure it. And I think for me, it's about understanding correlation and causality in these areas. And I think the data allows us to do that if we get our data set up correct. So I think, how do we integrate strategy effectively? I think that's a big question for me because, again, we've talked about going straight from objectives to activation without understanding data and audiences and channel mix, etc., can be really dangerous. So, yeah, again, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, of course. I think for us, kind of in the strategic plan team and sort of working with yourselves in data, it's kind of how can we understand the user journey, and how can we implement that across the entire funnel. So it's not just considering one platform. We've got to really understand where they're going and really explain that across the full kind of, you can see on screen there, just understand that it needs to be considered sort of everywhere, not just one channel, not just the other.
Yeah. So I think for me, again, it's so rare that there is a single touch point. And it's interesting because I know we'll talk about it later on, but things like attribution modeling really play into this. Like we've seen, for example, last touch point used to be pretty much the industry standard measure, when I go back 5 to 10 years. Now we're looking at, linear attribution, whether we're looking at data-driven attribution that is being allocated in the platforms to really make sure we understand the value that each channel, each activity plays in that user journey when, as we said, there's typically 6 to 8 touch points in most consumer decision-making processes online. And then obviously the fact that there is then an average of 9 tactics, actual individual tactics being utilised by marketers. So I think it is so important to think about sort of how do we make sure that integration piece really works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, it's kind of just about stepping back. So how do we integrate effectively? Like looking at all of the different data sources, are they integrated? Can you tell a consistent story across them all? And then looking at strategy, do you have that one overarching messaging? When you look at all of these different channels, are they leaning towards that objective that you've set out? And do they all kind of like tell the same story? So just kind of stepping back and putting yourself in the shoes of the customer, I think.
So as you can see, we've wrapped data right around the edge there. We've talked about sort of strategy being central to what we do, but data being for me, the thing that didn't supercharge most sort of modern day marketing activities. So I think the next section we want to talk about the power of data in modern marketing. I think you've termed it there, Eve, why data is the backbone of 2026 marketing strategies. But it really is, like every talk I speak to, conversation I go to, or every talk I go to from our platform providers, whether that be Google, Meta, whoever else we're speaking to, is always talking about data integration, how that's the thing that is needed to really help you maximize and leverage maximum potential out of any given channel. So I think sort of data from our perspective really does define competitive advantage.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, there's businesses popping up all over the place. There's competitors, and it really is getting more competitive by the day. And I think it's more important than ever to really move from that intuition-led kind of approach to more data-led. And I've kind of put then and now, but I think really a lot of people are still in that middle one, kind of leaning into the blue square, where we're starting to look at cross-channel visibility. We're starting to integrate those data sources, but looking into 2026 and beyond, it's going to be more about predictive intelligence rather than sort of retrospective performance. So really, to be at the cutting edge of competition, having those real-time decisions, because I think if you're not there, you're too late. And that stat really kind of encapsulates it about how data-driven organizations are 23 times more likely to acquire customers.
And I think, again, I think from my perspective, speaking to a lot of organizations, like we do talk to people about that maturity scale. Do you know what I mean? Like, where do people currently sit? So when we take sort of over working with a client, for me, it's like, where do they currently sit on that scale? And what are the next steps? Like, what are the things that we need to do? I know we were talking, I know even you and I were speaking to an unnamed client recently in a meeting where we were talking about how do we go from very much that data-informed piece where it was, yes, we were stitching data together, through to things like how we were data-led, so how were we actually feeding the machine, and then we were getting into that predictive space. And I think for me, that's where, as I say, we're going to see the maximum value and the maximum impact. And then I guess before insight definitely leads on to that integration piece. Like, I can't think over the last 3 to 6 months how many conversations I've been sat in with where you and I have been speaking to clients about the need for that really seamless integration piece and having that bit nailed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's on purpose that this is called from dashboards to decisions, because you've seen how many touch points there are now. There's just getting more and more. So it's really about how do you integrate that data to be able to tell that consistent story, to one, feed into strategy. But again, the attribution issues that we'll have are like still prevalent. So it's like, how do you know that if you turn something off over here, it's not going to affect something else over there? But also impact in sort of like online and offline journeys. Do you have those integrated? Do you know how your marketing spend is really affecting your bottom line? And can you make those decisions really quickly? So I think, yeah, just looking at the stat there, only 31% of marketers actually believe that they've got that integration in place, and it's costing people quite a lot of money.
And I think the thing for me is probably why that stat's so low is because it is quite complex to do. I think for me, the big thing here is the platforms often don't make it easy for you to do, because, you know, if you think, whichever platforms we've got, they don't really like speaking to each other too much, and they're all squabbling over attribution and who's taking credit for this and who's taking credit for that. And attribution windows are different on different platforms. So I think for me, this isn't an easy thing to do, but it's such, as you say, we led with this. It is for me the thing that is going to definitely supercharge your organisation as you move forward. If you get this bit licked, it then sets the foundation for everything else to build upon. I think if you don't have this bit sorted, the challenge then massively becomes is you are in that sort of stitching world. And what you're doing is you often can get sort of misattribution or inaccurate reporting. And then the reality is you're making decisions based on bad data sets. And that to me is probably one of the single biggest risks to most in marketing these days. So I think so important. And I think if everything's measured, why isn't it clear? Sort of, again, we've just touched on it there, but it's so important, isn't it, around having the skill set to do this within your team. And if you don't, again, understanding where you can go to get that support and the skill set needed to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like if you're looking at the last slide thinking, well, we have really good dashboards, it's like, well, yeah, I think data is no longer that luxury of having all this data. It's almost assumed. But I think where a lot of the gap is where people don't actually know, once they've got these nice fancy dashboards, what to actually do with the data and how to tell that story that feeds performance. So it's just to say really in 2026, look to be upskilling your workforce on how to read that data, because as technology is advancing, the skills gap is only getting bigger. And as AI kind of takes over more of this data world, yes, it will do some of it for us, but we know with ChatGPT and things at the minute, it's never 100%. So you really need to have those skills to be able to read the data and know when the AI is wrong as well.
And I think for me, as we've seen sort of marketing and sales, sort of, we could have a whole session on the role of marketing and sales or marketing and commercial. But for me, sort of, it's so important that there's a one single view of that, because I think that conflicting interpretations across teams is definitely one of the challenges here. I've seen a lot of clients instances where we're talking about marketing metrics that look like one thing and the sales team might be saying something else. And you start going, that alignment is so important, because ultimately, as I say, we're a performance agency, so we always try and get to, well, what are we actually trying to drive? What is the end performance? Not just some of those more sort of vanity secondary measures, as we would call them, like CPC is doing this, great, but is it actually leading to better quality customers coming through? And therefore, is that in line with what your business model is and how you've actually structured your organisation? So I think for me, this comes down to the essence of like, making sure you do have that single source of truth, to make sure that that is the heartbeat and everybody's singing off the same hymn sheet, and then you can align around that. I think it's so important. And I guess the data landscape is shifting from reporting to sort of decision intelligence, and we've highlighted sort of three key themes in there, haven't we, Eve?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned a few times, the data landscape is changing, and it's changing really quickly. So these are three sort of key takeaways from Salesforce and from Gartner, but really around dashboards, moving from dashboards to decision intelligence. So as I mentioned, we're moving from that sort of retrospective view to the predictive view. So dashboards and AI kind of doing a lot of that narrative for us and helping us with those stories. And then the next one is really around the skills gap. So while that might sound contradictory that AI is going to do it all, like I mentioned, it's not perfect. We still need to have those skills to be able to read the data in the meantime. And it's a whole new set of skills that we're going to need when AI really starts to take effect with the data. So that's a big one. And then the last one is just around how strategy is becoming continuous, not periodic. So I think we're used to working in sort of cycles of like, kind of do the strategy, measure it, feed it back in, where it's like now it's sort of like constantly measuring throughout and not doing it in these quarterly or monthly cycles, just all the time be rolling that into the strategy.
Yeah, and I think that for me gives us such an opportunity as well, because we're learning as we're going and then able to make those changes as we move forward with the data. I think that's so important, because as you say, I think often organisations get to a point where it's like business plan gets done, commercial plan gets done, our marketing plan gets done, and it's like, right, that's the course for the next 12 months. And it's like, but we all know in reality, it is iterative and it does move. So I think the fact that we're changing the feedback loop and the way that we can access data on a more sort of regular, I guess, shorter periods of time, I think so important. Turning it insights into impact then, I think we want to come to you, Becca, for this section to talk about the core principles to a data-led strategy. So ultimately, what does all of this mean? Once we've got the data and we've sort of built out that foundation, it's like, so what do we do with this?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important question is, it's great also kind of, as Eve was saying, to be able to understand the data, but then to be able to kind of, it's a two-prong approach, to be able to then put it into action is, equally as I'm going to say that, but it's equally as important.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this is mapped out just like a data-led framework for that sort of brand growth. So I've kind of put 5 steps in here. You've got sort of identify, which we'll talk through, and you've got those 5 sort of key pillars on there, and it'll loop back around into measure. So it's just kind of how can we take this fully through sort of the circle. Just kind of understand the profile segment is probably the most important on this one.
Yeah, and we've got a section really, haven't we, an overview on each of those areas. So I think the first, identifying your most valuable customers. It's something we always talk about, the Pareto principle, 80-20, etc. Most marketers sort of often can cite that. But I think for me, like, how do we actually do that then?
Yeah, I think there's a 2-pronged approach to this as well. Identifying your valuable customers first comes from the data. You have to kind of see, lifetime value. It all feeds into that lifetime value, who's coming back. It kind of ties into your business goals as well as like, who is the most valuable to you? Is it someone that makes a big one-time purchase? Is it someone that comes back very frequently for those littler purchases? And then it's kind of mapping that out, I suppose, in a little bit more depth, which we'll go into on the next slide.
So yeah, like you say, then we look at, once we've done that and we've identified who the most valuable customers is, the ultimate aim is go and find more of those.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, how do we actually find those? And I guess the big step is we really want to really understand who those people are at a really in-depth level.
Yeah, really granular. I think you can use so many tools to do this. My bread and butter is kind of GWI, and we'll talk through that a little bit later. But you kind of explore the behaviours of those priority customers. So I think it's really well and good to understand the data, but you really do need to know the audience to be able to, attract them and talk to them on their level. So, it's things like, where do they shop most? What channels are they over-indexing on? So if somebody's on TikTok, there's no point advertising to them on LinkedIn because it's really not going to align with what they're looking for. So I think, and especially always on now, that's a massive change. Like, we'll have to hit people when they're always on these channels.
Yeah.
So it's kind of identifying them, exploring the behaviours, and kind of feeding that into the messaging a little bit more.
And that then leads us nicely into sort of how we do go about creating campaign assets and messaging. I think we often map that against a funnel approach, but I think for us, I know we talk about this later, it is very cyclical, this. It's not everybody just goes through one linear journey, which is what we talked about at the beginning. But I think for us, it's about breaking down those stages and saying, right, how do we make sure we're feeding people with the right content, the right assets at the right time?
At the right time. And I think as well with the funnel, it's so, we talk about this quite often, it's so bespoke to each business. For some clients, it's just pure awareness. For some, it's just decision. It really depends on where your business is, what the product is, and where you kind of slot into that. It's not a one stage fits all, but I think being able to kind of take that messaging and sort of feed it into this is kind of the key to a good strategy as well.
Yeah, and I think that for me is one of the things I would say is one of the actionable takeaways. I think if organisations really need to think about this, and I have to think it's a really good exercise, even when you think you've got this lit, I think it's like so good to take a step back and go, what are we using at each stage? Like, what are the key messages we're actually trying to get across at each stage? What channels are we using? What type of assets do we want to use? And I think for me, start having those sort of challenging conversations internally to challenge sort of the status quo. Then I guess we move into sort of that activation. So once we've got all of the insight, it's then how do we activate?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this, again, it all leads back to that understanding that audience perfectly. So you can actually activate across the right platforms. Like we said before, 6 to 8 touch points, depending on, how complex the product is or how complex the journey is. You have to make sure that you're kind of activating that on the right channels, which again, if you don't have the data, you don't really know where people are going to hang out, where people are always on. So I think being able to kind of feed those 4 stages into this final one is really important to kind of, make sure that you are hitting people at the right time across the funnel.
And I think the consistency of message as well across the piece, like so many times do I see, like, again, it's really unusual. You see it on the likes of Instagram, etc., where you'll see a very clear message on sort of from an advertising perspective or from an organic post. Then you land on the website, it's like a totally different experience. And it's like going, it is quite jarring. So I think, we've talked many a time in the user experience UI sort of workshops that we've done in the past around making sure that we've got that consistency and that brand narrative sort of, stitched throughout. So I think it's so important.
And I think that's, going back on, I think that's kind of where brands, again, need to have those challenging conversations, because it's great to have a sort of strategy for, Meta, for TikTok, wherever it is. But again, if your website, if your organic social, if it's not matching up, again, you're just giving a little bit less of a good customer journey in terms of that.
And then into measurement. So then this is, I think, for me, how we then link it all back around as well, is like, again, we need to understand sort of what's worked, how to do more of it. And again, not just moving beyond correlation and definitely into causality, like what is actually driving performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where that first framework slide should have been more of a cycle, because like once we do this measurement piece, like I mentioned, it goes all the way throughout. It's not that periodic feedback, and it will kind of then fall into every stage once you've done it the first time. And I think going back to like the sales and marketing debate, that's where the funnel really comes in, because it's like marketers are kind of looking at the full thing, whereas sales might be just looking at the bottom. So the first thing we do when we're on board any clients is we do that identify piece. So although they might know who their customers are, we'll look at the data and we'll kind of make sure we agree. But then also the measurement piece, we'll create all clients a new KPI framework, and we'll set out at the very beginning of the relationship all of the different metrics and platforms that we're going to be used to measure. And I think when you kind of look at that and you're consistently measuring the same KPIs, then you kind of know when things are up or down. And then you can make those decisions. So you're not like looking at awareness metrics in one monthly report, and then the next one you're looking at consideration. You're constantly having that same reporting like framework that you look at every time to make sure you can feed those optimizations.
Yeah, and I think, look, whilst the aim of this like a masterclass that we do is always around sort of making sure we're sharing those insights, we appreciate that there'll be people out there sort of as they're going through listening to this session questioning like, you know, do they actually have everything in place that they need? Have they got the data layer in their organization to do all of these things? Because again, as we said right at the beginning, if you don't have the data sort of base absolutely nailed and aligned, and then everything else can actually become misaligned increasingly. So I always say it's so important that we get this foundational layer in across all of our digital marketing activity. So what I would always say, we like to obviously offer everybody who's listening, watching, etc., an opportunity to engage with us and get that free tailored support. If anybody does want that sort of free strategic digital enablement audit, then do just click on the link that's in the chat, register, and we'll quite happily get one of the team to jump on a call and walk you through sort of the type of processes that we'll go through, talk to people about the maturity cycle that they're in terms of where do they fit against other organizations in a similar sector, but also make sure that we've got everything that we need set up within an organization, and what are those next steps that you might want to take and how do you go about that. So again, please do feel free to sort of click on the link in the chat and sign up. I guess for me then, as we move forward, when we're talking about understanding your audience, it's like, I guess, what is the challenges around businesses who don't understand their audience and sort of the implications that can have?
Yeah, I think kind of firstly, the most shocking stat when we were kind of going through this in this updates all the time is that 67% of businesses actually don't know who their kind of priority customers are. And I think that's quite a, you know, again, one of those hard internal conversations where it's like, do we actually know what we're putting out here? Like, is our marketing going to be effective if we're just doing a one-size-fits-all approach? So I think that's kind of the first thing to discuss there. And then I think it's kind of like, if you don't understand that audience, how are you integrating it effectively into the campaign? Like, how do you know what you're going to get from it? How do you know the customers that you target and are going to actually be beneficial to the sort of goal of the company?
Yeah, and I think that then leads into that second statistic, doesn't it? Around 82.4% of businesses don't confidently know their customers' pain points. Yeah. Well, it sort of leads on from the former point, doesn't it? 67% businesses don't understand how the customers think. Mm-hmm. Then how do you go to understand the pain points? So it's an ever-decreasing pool then. Yeah. And I think, again, this is where I see so much waste. You know, when I think about marketing and definitely a lot of the conversations I have, it very much always jumps straight into activation, mm-hmm. that channel approach. Yeah. But actually for me, it's like the loss that you can actually have. It's not about tweaking something in a campaign to make it more efficient in terms mm-hmm. of what it's doing. It's actually, if you don't get this bit right,
it's fundamental.
It's fundamental. It's like your whole base is wrong. So it's like mm-hmm. your spend isn't being as efficient, as effective as it could be, because we might not be targeting the right people ultimately. So I think there's so much in there, isn't there, around just making sure you've got this absolutely nailed.
Nailed, 100%. Like you can see on screen, 54% of businesses actually say that lack of insight is probably one of their biggest challenges. And I think, again, kind of like you say, having that nailed would alleviate so many of those problems.
So I guess then, how do we bridge the gap?
So I guess for me, it's kind of three kind of key pillars. So I think one, it's sort of deep audience insight. So again, using first-party data, using sort of qualitative and quantitative metrics to kind of measure that, really understand who that audience is definitely sort of the key from my sort of perspective on there. So really getting a granular look, who are we trying to target? how are we trying to speak to them? And again, that pain point thing, how do they want to be spoken to? Then I think it kind of goes into that data-driven strategy, So kind of using that market research, doing a little bit of competitor analysis, really understanding what needs to go into the strategy, making sure that the backbone of that is data. And then we'll always talk as an agency about sort of customer centricity. So kind of making sure that your customers are at the forefront really bridges the gap quite well, I think, in driving businesses' strategies forward.
Yeah, and this matters, doesn't it? Because again, we've got to think about tailored campaigns, improved ROI, long-term growth. If you don't have those things in place, those things become really, really difficult to achieve.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. You can't achieve them if you don't know who exactly you're targeting, how you're targeting them, what data works, what doesn't. I think it really is kind of the core to any good strategy.
And I also think data gives you the ability to scale. So scalability with confidence, rather than it being that sort of test and learn approach, it becomes a test and learn based upon the data rather than test and learn based on sort of those assumptions or that sort of gut feel, if you like, earlier in the process.
Yeah, and I think people are really investing heavily in marketing now. We see like paid media spends can be massive for some organizations. And like you say, it really helps you like make those decisions, especially where, spending money's involved, to make sure you are making a bit more of a calculated risk rather than just jumping straight in.
And I think like the way that we visualize that, I think for me, it's always been about like, we then look at things like how do we build out personas, and we're not going to go into this in any depth, but again, we just wanted to showcase really sort of how we use the likes of GWI to understand really persona on a page. For me, this is so important, and looking at the key areas, so business challenges, useful content, like sources to keep up to date with industry. I think like, again, looking at things like the social channels that specific users and potential customers are engaging with, so important to get this bit right. Because then that's got to drive everything else. So it's so important that we align this from driving our creative, channel selection, messaging, etc., right through to then how do we measure, how do we then use the first party data to then feed everything else. So I think that's so important. In the final few minutes, just want to provide a bit of a conclusion and summary and around next steps, really. So I think for me, 5 key takeaways. And again, probably just a point on this. So Eve, AI is definitely sort of shifting data analysis from retrospective to predictive. That's a big thing.
Yeah, so like I mentioned on the earlier slides, we're kind of moving to a place where we're no longer just looking back. It's like straight away from the first instance in reporting, looking forward. It's like not dwelling on kind of the previous performance too much, but those AI like insights will be just telling us straight away kind of what to do next and really feeding a lot of that narrative.
We've seen that in lots of channels, I think, for me. Like machine, I've said lots of times in these masterclasses, like we almost act like AI is a new thing. And the reality is AI is a relatively new term, but machine learning's been in place for absolute years in across digital marketing, whether that be in paid search campaigns when we used to have, automated bidding was introduced like 6-7 years ago now. So we've been doing those things, which for me is really interesting. But it is that move from retrospective, analysing what's happened and then using AI to analyse what has happened, to then moving into that predictive space where we're able to now use AI to go out and find audiences or similar customers or, however we're driving that, like customer matching as a perfect example. So important.
Yeah.
The customer journey is growing longer, but cross-channel clarity lags behind.
So you want to take this one back?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. Yeah, I think that's the thing. That journey, as we've kind of mentioned a few times through this, it is just growing. It's really nuanced to the business, the product. So I think just kind of understanding that is growing longer, but we need to seek clarity on where they actually are touching points and making sure that we're kind of aligned with that, I suppose.
Yeah, and there isn't a one size fits all in that space, which is, again, what keeps our jobs really interesting, is because it's so different, whether we're talking about retirement homes, whether we're talking about modular buildings, whether we're talking about luxury concierge services or houses. Like they've all got their own different processes and systems and mechanisms and customer journeys ultimately. So again, that more tailored approach is so important. The skills gap is widening as tech advances. I think you've covered that previously, Eve. I think like that's a massive piece, isn't it? As the tech moves and evolves, it's like so important that we're trying to stay on the front foot. Like coming on this masterclass, probably a good first step in that, in terms of being aware, and the fact that you're here listening is a good step that we're trying to broaden that knowledge base out. But for me, this is so important as organisations evolve and move forward, that they've got to stay up to date with this activity. First party data. Talk to me about first party data.
Yeah, so another stat in one of the reports that I was reading is that people are really, really moving away from third-party data. And I think especially in this sort of AI world where there's lots of fake news and you can just read a stat anywhere, I think people are really, really trying to rely on that first-party data that they're collecting themselves from their own customer sort of platforms or doing sort of research and things. It's just really king because people are losing trust in those data sources. And at least, you know, if you've collected it yourself, then like, you're to blame if it's wrong, but yeah, it's just a lot more trustworthy.
Well, I find this hilarious because about 4 years ago we were talking about cookieless futures, right? And that was the spark really for first party data, making sure it's correct. And I think it's so important that whilst the cookieless future has changed, the conversation's moved on and evolved over a period of time, but that first party data piece is so important in a world where, as I say, the machine is hungry for quality, verified, correctly formatted data to help feed it. I think it's so important that we just make sure we get that first party data piece right. And ultimately, on the final point, understanding your audience is the key to a good strategy. You know, it's like put rubbish in, you get rubbish out with all of these things. And it's like, if we're not clear on what is driving performance and we're not clear on what we are measuring and we're not clear on what is driving performance, you make some pretty bad decisions and set off on the wrong direction. And I think for me, it's so important that we use sort of that audience piece to really drive our strategy. And hopefully that's what people have taken from today. As I say, if you do want support with that and you want sort of a free strategic data enablement audit, then please do click the link, sign up, etc. But I think for me, sort of that brings the end to what's been a really interesting, really insightful masterclass. So thank you very much, Eve. Thanks, Becca. And thanks for everybody listening. And I look forward to seeing you on the next MediaWorks masterclass. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.